Welcome, everybody. So I'm Alisha, Holland. I'm an associate professor in the government department, and I'm really excited to moderate today's panel on urban services in Latin America. It's been a bit of a golden age for work on urban politics in Latin America. There's lots of exciting new work coming out on variation in services, variation in electoral politics, and trying to think through some of the classic questions about when governments invest in services, when they improve the quality of urban services. So that's what we're going to get to touch on today with three fantastic scholars. All of their names begin with AL, we've been commenting. They've all received their PhDs from Harvard, but beyond that criteria, they do provide different perspectives on the research. So we're excited to have them here today. Before I turn to our speakers, I'm joined today by Fran Hagopian, and our Jefe Maximo Steve Levitsky will be here shortly. And also, we'd love to hear from the audience during today's presentation. We obviously have an audience in the room that we'll field questions from at the end, but you can also submit questions online through the Q&A function. Also, just a quick reminder, we have one last Tuesday seminar of the season, which will be next week with Rodrigo Barnechea, so don't miss that as well. All right, so let me turn to our speakers. First up, we have Alison Toast, who is an associate professor of political science and global metropolitan studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Her first book was a great inspiration to me when I was in graduate school. She was one of the first people really taking seriously the privatization of urban services and infrastructure. So her book is Foreign and Domestic Investment in Argentina, The Politics of Privatized Infrastructure. And she's gone on to write a number of fabulous articles on urban politics and other themes around private investment in the region. She's also a great public goods provider. She is the chair of the Rapal Conference on the Political Economy of Latin America, as well as a former president of the Urban and Local Politics section of the American Political Science Association. And of course, she did her PhD here at Harvard. Second, we'll hear from Alisha, who's a postdoctoral associate in political economy at Yale University this year. She just defended her dissertation from Harvard this spring, which is a fabulous study of urban inequality and segregation in Latin America that is part of a broader book project looking at the historical political causes of slum formation and segregation. And starting in July, she'll be an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and in the Department of Political Science. So we miss her here, but are excited for her next stages. And last, we'll hear from Alyssa Huberts, who defended her dissertation in December here at Harvard, a fabulous study of water, politics, and quality in Mexico City. Alyssa is now a social scientist at the lab at DC, where she helped the Washington, DC mayor office apply research and social science methods to test city programs. So having real world impact and improving American cities, as well as studying Latin American ones. And she focuses on infrastructure and basic urban services like piped water, public transit, and collection. So we're going to hear from them in that order. I've asked each of them to speak for about 12 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions from the audience and draw together some of the broader lessons and themes from today's discussion. So Alison, why don't you kick us off?
Great. First of all, I just want to thank you for the very kind invitation to join you here today. I remember, very fondly my time at Doctor class and the support that I received while working on my dissertation work at Harvard there. And it's such a great opportunity to be on this panel with Alyssa and Alice. So thanks so much for the invitation. I'm just going to say a moment about the background that I'm bringing in terms of geography and disciplinary expertise to these comments. So I'm a political scientist by training, but I also have a background in urban planning, and I've done research in a variety of countries in the region. I'm currently working in Brazil and Argentina, and as Alisha noted, my dissertation work was in Argentina, and I've also been working in India as well. So some of those experiences may kind of filter into the comments I'm going to provide. So the question Alisha posed to our panel was, why are services so bad in large cities in Latin America? And I think we can all think of imagery and news articles that would certainly be consistent and give rise to this impression. We've witnessed over the last decade or so protests regarding public transit, fare hikes in major cities in Brazil and Chile. We've all seen imagery and data related to high rates of crime in major cities in the region, such as Rio and Sao Paulo. And then there are perhaps less well commented in the news, but major issues with the pollution of urban waterways in the region, such as the Riachuelo Basin in Buenos Aires, right? So a lot of major urban problems coming up in the largest megacities in the region, which very rightly give rise to this sense that there are issues that cities in the region simply aren't grappling with. So I want to start off by walking through, or actually saying why this puzzle that Alisha posed is particularly compelling. So first, if we think about who has access to revenue to actually deliver urban services in the region, larger cities actually tend to have more revenue at their disposal, certainly more own source revenue. That means revenue from municipal taxes and fees that are not tied to grants from national governments for specific programs than in comparison small and medium-sized cities in the region. And this is because the property tax is typically the most important source of own source revenue in the region, just as it is in the United States. And larger cities simply have more high value real estate in the formal sector that they can tax. So whereas a small municipality in Brazil, for example, may only derive 5% of its revenues from local taxation, this figure can be as high as 40% in larger cities. So this suggests that whatever deficiencies we're observing in large cities is not just a story of resource availability, and particularly resources that they can control, because they are, resources that were raised locally. Another reason why the puzzle that Alisha posed is compelling is that larger cities are also much better placed to secure international grants, like the world or loans from institutions like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank. And I've been having recently having conversations with the coordinators for country lending for the World Bank in various countries in the region, and they've really, this is what's really come across in conversations with them is, in terms of urban sector loans, most of those are going to the larger cities in the region. Okay, so we have more resources available. Why are services still struggling, not up to what we might expect in the larger cities? So I'd like to start off first by considering various factors that contribute to poor service quality and reach in larger cities. The first is that what we think of as standard urban problems are actually greater in larger cities. These are essentially reflections of externalities of urban growth. So traffic congestion, for example, grows with city size, and traffic congestion makes it difficult to operate bus services as the buses themselves become caught up in the same traffic that everyone else is contending with. And even as we carve out bus rapid transit lanes, due to lack of compliance with rules, and Alisha, among others, have spent a lot of time thinking about this broader phenomena. You often have parked cars or bicycles or anything else in the lanes where these buses might go. Metro projects, meanwhile, are extremely expensive and difficult to pull off logistically and politically. So you have, these big urban problems like traffic congestion that grow with city size that are hard to tackle. Another, quote, urban problem that tends to take on a more severe form in larger city is crime and security problems, which tend to correlate, albeit imperfectly, with city size. This makes policing particularly challenging in larger contexts, especially in larger cities, especially in contexts with organized crime. And then a third kind of standard urban problem that correlates with city size that economists would attribute kind of directly to externalities of urban growth is pollution, with the caveat that local economic base is going to matter here as well. So I'll illustrate this by talking a little bit about the water sector as an example. Groundwater is simply much more likely to become contaminated in larger cities. Sometimes this is a result of industrial pollution, having more manufacturing facilities that are not terribly well regulated, that are emitting water into local rivers and streams or directly into the aquifer. Often it's actually because of nitrate contamination, and this is abetted by the faster expansion of water networks than the sewage network. So you essentially have the water table becoming contaminated as cities grow. And this means that water utilities have to operate much more complex water and wastewater treatment systems. In larger cities, these cost a lot of money. They're difficult to roll out logistically. It means water has to be conveyed over larger distances to actually bring water of decent quality that can be treatable to where people need it. So essentially have much greater technical challenges in these larger cities with delivering a service that we all consider to be essential. You might, in a smaller city, it might be feasible for houses in urban neighborhoods to rely on household wells or at least local treated surface water systems. You get to larger cities and it's just a massively more complex enterprise to manage. Okay, so that was point one. We have these urban problems that take on much more significant forms in larger cities that require more technically sophisticated and financially expensive responses, which should often actually be politically very difficult to pull off as well. A second point I'd like to make relates to coordination. The problem of developing, or the challenge of developing coordinated responses to urban service problems is greater in larger cities. As we're all familiar with, even from the case of Boston, right? Large metropolitan areas tend to span multiple municipal jurisdictions. And as cities grow, they eat up, they kind of spread into these more and more municipalities. And so this leads to an institutional question. Who actually manages what we think of as, quote, urban services in Latin American cities? Some, quote, urban services are indeed managed by municipalities in the region. We can think of trash and recycling collection, the extent to which that's actually happening within the formal sector, street lighting, local roads, some basic social welfare systems, social services, and sometimes education. So in Argentina, no. Brazil, yes, for elementary schools. So there's some variation across cases. In some cases, basic health services. So in Brazil, yes. In Argentina, no, except for the province of Buenos Aires. But in these kind of areas that are kind of more likely to be managed by municipalities, we have this coordination issue, right, across municipalities. So one example of this is the health sector, where we can think of issues with coordinated COVID response in places like Brazil. And I'll just mention one of my dissertation students at Martinez is working on understanding municipal level variation in terms of the strength and efficacy of COVID response in the Brazilian case. And there you often, you can just imagine how complicated it is. One municipality has a quarantine, the other doesn't. One does lockdown, one doesn't, but there's obviously lots of back and forth movement between these municipalities, right? So there have been consortia that have existed in some of the Brazilian metropolitan areas, but this isn't the same as having a single kind of well thought out and coordinated response by a single agency. So fragmentation within municipalities makes coordination quite difficult for the services that municipalities actually do deliver. Then we have another institutional issue, which is many, quote, urban services are actually managed by provincial or state governments in the region, or state-owned enterprises that are supervised by state or provincial or even national governments. And this can often make sense given this landscape of jurisdictional fragmentation that I've just mentioned. So we can think about policing, for example. This is a provincial responsibility in Argentina, for example, with the city of Buenos Aires now possessing its own police force. But if we look outside of Buenos Aires, it's a provincial function. Public transit, this is typically contracted out to concessionaires, so private companies that have long-term contracts to manage services. In the Argentine case, the provinces concessioned out bus services since the 1990s. These concessions are actually in In Buenos Aires, handled by the national government, and the provinces handled by the provincial governments. So performance of these services is tied to what national or provincial regulatory agencies are doing, rather than what municipal governments are doing. The levers of control with respect to what people are charged for services, whether companies are sanctioned for not meeting their targets in terms of frequency of services, et cetera, quality of buses, safety of buses, et cetera. The levers of control over that are actually not in the hands of municipal governments. So even though we've witnessed decentralization in many areas, it's not affecting a number of these very crucial urban services. Water and sanitation is another example. So these are typically state-owned enterprises, in fewer cases, private concessionaires at the state or provincial level. So in Brazil, for example, the water is officially a municipal responsibility in the constitution, but under the military government, municipalities were encouraged to enter long-term contracts with the state governments to manage services. In Argentina, a national water company was broken up into provincial companies at roughly the same time as the transition to democracy. These entities possess more economies of scale to manage these large, complex urban water systems, to move surface water across distances to where it's needed, to build big treatment plants, however, et cetera. However, their scale means that they're not as accessible to individual citizens or pressures by city councilors, and that they're less well placed to coordinate with work in other areas of urban policy. So I remember doing my field work and in Argentina in the water sector, and one of the constant complaints was simply, one company would dig up the street and fix their problem relating to, let's say, drainage, and then someone else would come and dig up the street the next week for something else, right? There's this kind of lack of coordination between essentially different provincially controlled providers that were not coordinating because they had specific functional specializations. A final type of coordination problem stems from the fact that large cities in the region have at various points of time been controlled by the political opposition. So whoever is at power at the national level is not necessarily the party in power in the larger cities. And this can make it make it hard to access national funding if you need to invest in capital improvement projects for large urban systems, whether it be transit, whether it be water, et cetera, right? It's just politics feeds, of course, into these negotiations over funding for specific projects. Okay. So that was a broader point about the difficulties of coordination in large cities. There's another point that I think it's important to underscore, which is that political pressure and protest do not always improve service quality. I mean, part of the logic and the rationale for administrative decentralization in the region was this notion that if you bring decision-making about services closer to citizens, they're going to be in a better position to monitor management, to know who to complain to actually make those complaints, et cetera. But what we've learned over the last several decades, in part due to this research wave that Alisha mentioned, is that political pressure doesn't always result in service quality improvements and can actually push in countervailing directions. This can be particularly the case in networked infrastructure services and in larger cities that are more likely to possess complex networked infrastructure like subways or extensive piped water networks. So why is this the case? Political economy scholarship and historians have long observed that within these types of systems, system users typically apply political pressure to keep prices low. It's very understandable. You have a limited budget. You only want to spend so much riding the subway, et cetera, every month. And what this leads to is essentially a situation in which it is not politically attractive to charge enough money in tariff revenue to actually fund maintenance in systems, much less expansion to kind of reach new populations that are coming to cities with urban growth. So Spiller and Safedoff, working on the water sector, famously talked about this in terms of a low-level equilibrium that develops that's characterized by essentially a desire to keep tariffs low, political incentives to do that, less money going into actually keeping the system up and running, to poor service quality, which makes people even less likely to want to pay anything for services because they're frustrated with service quality. So you essentially have this vicious cycle that develops. So there are real and important reasons why this occurs. Wages in middle income countries are low and earnings are unequal, particularly when fares or tariffs are not tied to ability to pay. That meaning there's no progressive pricing scheme. Many potential beneficiaries of services will be unlikely to afford them. Meanwhile, there are political pressures for patronage employment within these the state-owned companies or governments that are operating facilities, particularly following democratization in the region. So this result is a situation in which there's few political payoffs to actual investment and maintenance. Tariffs are kept low, not adjusted to keep up with inflation, and a large fraction of revenues ends up being devoted to payroll rather than maintenance or capital projects. So privatization in the region was, in the infrastructure sector, was intended to address these perverse incentives, to kind of insulate providers from political pressures, particularly with respect to pricing. However, what ended up happening is that pricing remained politicized and became in many senses more so, especially when private providers, service providers, were seen to be making profits from delivering services. Just some anecdotes from fieldwork here. What I observed in Buenos Aires is that the citizen boards that were set up to monitor the water services in the metro area in Buenos Aires, most of the complaints that were coming in were from middle to upper middle class consumers about prices. Very few complaints were coming in from those who were waiting for water connections on the urban fringe, right? Who were in part due to the way the cross subsidization schemes were set up. The idea was that tariff revenue was supposed to help fund expansion into areas that did not yet have water services. So we have this political participation, but it's directed in one area rather than kind of holistically around service quality and access. So most services, as I stressed, are now managed by the public sector. Infrastructure privatization was kind of this wave, particularly in areas like water, that is now subsided. But these tensions that I've described still persist within the context of public sector management, in part because we have many of these companies that were privatized and brought back under state control have retained the Sociedad Anónima format for management, meaning that they're private companies incorporated under private law, but owned by the public sector. So before closing, so wrapping up, that's kind of a broader point about how decentralization hasn't necessarily led to kind of political incentives for improvement in service quality. Before closing, however, I want to question or poke a little bit at the unstated premise of the panel that services in larger cities are worse than those in smaller cities. From what I've been able to figure out based on the data I've collected so far for my current book project, the data actually appears to be quite mixed on this and likely varies significantly across service areas. I recently published a piece with Nick Kuipers in Perspectives on Politics that shows that there are many more state-run basic health clinics and public schools per capita in smaller cities in Brazil than in larger ones. Yet at the same time, test scores and immunization rates do not appear to vary with municipal population size. So when we think about whether or not problems are worse in larger cities, this is something where I think we actually need to do a bit of carefully working through the data and kind of understanding what the actual patterns are. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to other panelists. I'm really curious what Alyssa and Alice will have to say on this topic, and thanks once again.
Great, thank you so much, Alison. So on to our next AL speaker. We have Alice.
Great, I'm gonna share screen really quickly. Can you see my screen?
It looks like your version, looks like your computer.
Don't have the full screen. Like,
No full screen.
You
Okay.
don't have a presentation.
Do you see the presentation now?
Yeah, yes. ma'am.
Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, so I'm very excited to be here to discuss why urban services are still so bad in large Latin American cities. And I just wanted to say many thanks again to Alisha and Dr. Klaas more broadly for the invitation. And I'll focus on answering this question primarily through the lens of urban Brazil, also building on what Alison said. So this panel is focused on, again, this question of why urban services are still so bad. And there's emphasis on still because there's reason to expect that by now, urban service provision should have improved substantially. Large cities in Latin America began forming more than half a century ago. And in addition, countries in the region have now experienced more than 3 decades of democratic rule. So there's very good reason to expect substantial improvements, if not even, universal coverage of urban services by now. But unfortunately, there remains considerable deficiencies in provision. So we see that even as recently as 2020, coverage of sewage services, for instance, continues to lag across urban Latin America and the Caribbean. And given these trends, it does make one wonder, did democracy actually make a difference for public services in the region? The answer for me is definitively yes, it has substantially. And just to step back a little, I want to emphasize that the point that urban public services is really about rights to the cities for slums, for the poor in particular. In Brazil's case, when there are deficiencies in the aggregate city level provision of services, the incidence of the deficiencies largely falls on the city's poor living in informality. So the incidence of slums across cities, not completely, but almost neatly maps onto deficiencies in aggregate levels of public service deficiencies at the city level. And therefore, for me, public services is really a question of when the city chooses to formalize slums, and which means to extend rights to land and property for the communities, which in turn allows for the extension of urban services once they are part of the formal city. And the second point I want to emphasize here is that democracy mattered because it extended these rights. So after Brazil democratized, its 1988 constitution promulgated urban rights and universal access to basic sanitation and other urban services to all peoples, including to populations that settle illegally. So this is a direct product of Brazil's transition to democracy. And conversely, during the previous decades of authoritarian rule, the military dictatorships that governed Latin America viewed the massive waves of the in-migrating rural poor to cities as a symbol of disorder, the disruption of social control in cities. So there's qualitative evidence that the military regimes that govern Latin America actively withheld urban services in proper social housing, creating the modern favelas and villas. And empirically in the data, we do see that while favelas, communities deficient in public services, proliferated during the years of the military dictatorship circled in red, its incidence decreased within the first decade of democratic rule, with of course some exceptions. So democracy affects urban services because it extended rights and formalized slums. It actually reduced the number of slums, as we can see here. However, nonetheless, it is clear today that there still remains extensive deficiencies in service coverage. So the question remains, why are urban services still so bad? And I think that part of the complication is that for many Latin American countries, the decade of deepening democracy, the 1990s, was also that of political and administrative decentralization. So the development of the region's cities during the decades of military rule was characterized by highly centralized urban planning. And I think this quote from an interview with Eduardo Brito, former mayor of the Brazilian city of Salvador, who was mayor under military rule, captures this sentiment well. So he explained that it was all centrifugal. During the military's time, urban planning comes from the top downwards, from the center to the periphery, to the question of what policy is good for a coastal city in the Northeast, such as Salvador. The same policy is that for Avenida Paulista in São Paulo. And he was like frustrated about how, he could not even build a simple fountain in the center of the city. So what little in urban planning there was highly centralized during military rule, and therefore cities developed uniformly. But with regime change and decentralization, mayors across Latin American cities were directly elected beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, creating divergent trends in urban development across cities. And the effects of decentralization on urban services, I would say, have been mixed. So in Peru, the decentralization of tax collection for natural resources, such as its mining tax, gave local governments a huge boost in revenue, especially during the commodity boom. But this did not result in better urban services. It only resulted in spikes in local corruption. A similar story applies to Mexico, where state governments experienced a 20-fold increase in intergovernmental transfers from the federal government. But this only led to a surge in corruption among governors. And in contrast, in Honduras, it actually presents a case of, I would say, successful decentralization. So it passed a law in 2003 to decentralize water and sanitation services from the federal to municipal management, which reportedly improved service provision a great deal. And overall, Latin American countries decentralized in the 1990s, but they are still decentralizing even more now. And the jury is still out for some of these more recent efforts to decentralize further. It's also fascinating how, just to echo what Alison said earlier, it's so fascinating how within countries, there's also this variation in decentralization across different types of urban services. So for instance, public security is managed at the state level in Brazil and Argentina, but at the municipal level in Mexico, and at the federal level in Chile, Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. And for primary education, it's municipal in Brazil and at the state level in Mexico. For sewage and water services, it's largely municipal in Brazil, between municipalities in the state in Argentina, but like more so the state, and yet at the state squarely and even at the federal levels elsewhere in Latin America. So it's difficult to definitively assess the effect of decentralization as a whole for each of these countries, given also this variation across service types. And Alison already talked about the coordination problems across jurisdictions, whether it's like municipalities or states. And in addition, the political calculus for the governor is just quite different than that for the mayor. The governor's concerned with like inter-municipal allocations, whereas the mayor is focused on within city allocation, largely between social groups. So it's hard to like definitively assess these mixed effects, but I'll just add two things here. One is that decentralization often does exacerbate intra-city inequities in service provision within countries. And in addition, decentralization without the accruement of local human capital in tandem, local knowledge for the mayor, for city hall, for local bureaucracies can be quite disastrous. And a new working paper by Adam Auerbach, Shikhar Singh, and Tarek Thatchell for India illustrates this well. So besides how decentralization creates divergent patterns of service provision, what else really explains why cities differ in urban services? It's not really about municipal capacity only, as Alison has shown. So for example, the Brazilian cities of Belo Horizonte and Brasilia, the capital of Brazil here, are both among the largest cities in Brazil with comparable fiscal capacity. Yet curiously, the two cities differ considerably in their provision of sewage collection. The deficiencies for sewage are mapped in orange here. And it's not just about capacity, because if anything, we would expect that the capital of Brazil, Brasilia, has better access to federal government resources and provides more. It's really puzzling that cities of comparable size and capacity have such different service provision. In my dissertation, I advanced the argument that the geographic layout of class-based segregation of cities explains these differences. So Brasilia and Belo Horizonte look the way they do because Brasilia is so segregated, whereas Belo Horizonte is quite integrated with the favelas and vilas peppered in between even the more affluent areas of the city here. So if we were to take the collection of over 1,000 Brazilian cities and estimate the association between class-based segregation and expenditure on urban services, we see that there's this very strong negative correlation between segregation and provision. Segregated cities always underprovide public services, whereas integrated cities always provide more. And this is just an empirical axiom in the data. And a big question is why? Why do we see this? In my dissertation research, I find that the spatial externalities of inequality, such as sewage pollution, waterborne diseases, and organized crime, is the mechanism that explains the segregation effect. Class-based segregation reduces the incidence of these externalities that spill over from slums to the middle class. And conversely, in integrated, in other words, desegregated cities, the scale of such externalities undermines the perceived efficacy of alternative private household services. And therefore, class-based integration induces middle-class support for instead public goods shared with the poor. So in response to the question posed earlier to this panel, I would say that my response is that since Brazil democratized in the late 70s and early 80s, urban services still remain so bad in certain cities because they are so segregated along class lines and thus politically polarized. Segregation encourages the privatization of urban services, while integration, in other words, reduced segregation, because it induces these spatial externalities, aligns the urban class with the poor to form coalitions that support public services in place of private alternatives. And empirically across cities in Brazil, we do see that the most segregated large cities continue to have such laggard coverage of sewer lines for the majority of the poor populations. So now you may ask, does the middle class actually really matter? So there's this common assumption that in megacities, the median voter is poor. But using low-jet estimation here, we can see that as cities grow, the median voter is more likely to be middle class. Increasing population density predicts a median voter who is middle class. And in large cities such as São Paulo and Buenos Aires, the median voter has been middle class for a while since the 2000 census. So my second response for this question of why services are still so bad across cities in Latin America relates to understanding why some cities are so segregated in the first place. Recall that I said earlier that public services is about rights to the city for the poor. And in a working paper, I find that after Brazil decentralized, the partisan ideologies of local mayoral coalitions distort how federal policies affect the extension of these rights to the poor locally. So in the 1990s, cities that happened to be governed by just coalitions inclusive of Brazil's Workers' Party, the PT, implemented more favorable local legislations that formalized and protected centrally located favelas from evictions. These coefficients marked in red reflect this, whereas centrist and right-wing coalitions did the opposite, marked in blue. Thus, although Brazil's federal government stipulated these rights in the constitution in name only for favelas, decentralization ensured that this process of formalizing favelas did not occur uniformly. The partisan ideologies of local mayoral coalitions mattered. Where local legislation protecting the rights of slums were not passed, slums were evicted by neoliberal market forces, and they were forced to relocate to the city's periphery, creating a more segregated city. Okay, so to summarize the key takeaway points, while it took the US and Western Europe over 2 centuries to urbanize, the Latin American city grew in a matter of decades, and this growth took place primarily under authoritarian rule. The unprecedented pace of rural to urban migration created urban peripheral communities, the favelas and cortizos of Brazil, the vilas miserias of Argentina, that military dictatorships actually actively chose not to account for. And in many ways, the legacies of bad urban services even today can be explained by the birth defects of these cities because they developed so rapidly and haphazardly under authoritarian rule. Decentralization allows for divergences in urban development. And during the first decade of democracy and decentralized governance, we see that the partisan ideologies of local mayoral coalitions had an effect on the extension of rights and thus segregation and service provision. And in large cities, growing population density also means that the middle class is increasingly important. And in thinking about the middle class, their segregation from the poor really matters in determining when they form coalitions with the poor for public services in place of private alternatives. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much again.
Fabulous. Thank you, Alice. Let's turn it over to Alyssa for our last presentation.
All right, can you hear me? Wonderful. Let me share screen. Okay, and then full screen for Fran. You can see full screen? Yes or no?
Not yet,
Not yet.
but sometimes there's a delay.
Okay, let's try. It may not like full screen, Fran. We may have to go back to the
Well, but at least it doesn't look like a computer. At least if you've got notes there, we can't see. That's okay.
I don't have notes.
It was
Not
a-
because I didn't think about it, but let's see. Okay,
Um,
here we go. Share screen. Okay,
Yes,
we'll live with
email.
this. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, it's the mark of a senior scholar to be able to summarize an entire field in the developments of like 20 years in 12 minutes. I am not a senior scholar, so I'm not going to attempt that. But I would like to chat a little bit about one of the kind of over promises or developments in this space around electoral accountability. So really zooming in on the political side of these things. So democratization and decentralization offered great promises for service provision in Latin American cities. And I think you've gotten that from both Alison's point, is just that there was a lot of energy and a lot of excitement when these countries democratized and these cities decentralized, and to a lesser extent the cities also democratized, and around the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. But what I want to highlight is that electoral mechanisms, which were kind of seen as this big, exciting silver bullet that would improve services, won't improve services if the issue never becomes politicized, if it never makes it onto the electoral agenda. And it's one point, and I'm just going to walk you through it. So I'm going to talk about water in Mexico City as an example, a sort of case study of what can go wrong in this kind of prophetic vision of electoral accountability, improving public services in large cities. So this is a visual from the World Bank's 2004 World Development Report, which was called Making Services Work for Poor People, or maybe Making Services Work for the Poor. This vision kind of summarizes the policy context of that moment where you had the state, the providers, and the citizens and clients. And so this vision sort of laid out that you had the short route of accountability where citizens, as users, as clients directly would lobby providers when services weren't good, or they would go through politicians, right? So they would use their vote or their voice to sanction underperforming governments, and those politicians as a result would be really hold the providers accountable for providing high quality services. And this was kind of the vision that was laid out for how services were going to get better through democracy. And this really justified the case for decentralization, which you've heard both of my colleagues speak about. So there was going to be better information for citizens and politicians when we decentralized, because everything would be local. It would be easier to attribute credit or blame for when service quality was good or bad. And as it turns out, this is a lot harder than it sounds. So it looks really good on paper. There's a great Barden paper from 2006 that kind of talks about why this is so difficult in the developing world. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mexico City. So this is one of my favorite pictures from my fieldwork. This is a woman who has access to the grid. So this is not kind of Alice's slum dweller who's never been extended services. She has pipes that should deliver clean, reliable, predictable water. But instead, she's left to get this hose from a water truck and lift it up several stories to the buckets that she stores in her apartment, because her water that comes is so intermittent and so low pressure that she can't rely on it. And this is a very common experience in Mexico City. So 20% of neighborhoods that have access to the grid are still formally rationed. And in some of the neighborhoods, or some of the boroughs that I study, the number is more like 60, 70% of neighborhoods or residents are experiencing their water intermittently. So a couple hours a day or a couple days a week. So you have service delivery, but it's not high quality, right? It's not reliable. But despite this low quality, the issue tends to stay off the electoral agenda. So these are campaign ads that I've coded from local elections in 2012, 15, and 18 in Mexico City. And what you'll see is that water stays really close to the bottom of the electoral agenda, despite having this really basic essential service that you'd think would be kind of top of mind for citizens. The politicians aren't really talking about it. The citizens aren't voting on it. You know, I had conversations with pollsters and they said, we don't get it either. We would think, you know, our job is to do campaign strategy. We would like to make water the issue, and the politicians won't bite. The citizens won't bite. It's not on the agenda. So I spent a lot of time thinking about, well, why does such a basic essential service stay off the agenda? And I'm going to go through kind of these three reasons that in this case, we see these dynamics. The first is alternative forms of problem solving. So when you talk to citizens, they often don't believe that exercising their voice or their vote will make a difference. So this is a quote from a citizen that I interviewed. She said, why protest? All the mayor's going to do is show up and say, what do you want me to do? There's no water. So there's a sense that these problems are too large for the local politicians to solve, or that they're los políticos de siempre. They're never going to kind of do anything different than what's been done. But by comparison, a service like water, and this is different than some other services, but it's something that you can solve for yourself, and it's within your locus of control. And this, I think, is critically different than a service like crime or public health, where you really have to rely on the government. Even though water is networked infrastructure, there's a lot that the citizen can do to solve the problem. So you can see here, this is a diagram of a family household that we spent some time with. This is actually a pretty typical household. It's not unusual in its complexity. They have two separate pipelines, one for clean water that comes straight from the grid, that's in black, and then they have a separate one for blue for storage, because it turns out that the act of storing water actually contaminates it. So there's this vicious cycle where getting intermittent water makes the quality worse. They're storing water in buckets and barrels. They're using a manual pump to pump the water up from the cistern to the tinaco. They're monitoring it to see when there's water. They actually develop this sense of hearing. Hear it in the pipes, and they go to turn on the manual pumps. And what I want to highlight here is that this is a costly behavior in terms of time, in terms of cognitive load, in terms of effort, but it's something that the citizen themselves can control. And when things feel hopeless in the cities, citizens will turn to their own ways to address them. In the context I study in Mexico, you don't see as many kind of boreholes, as I'm sure Alison and Alice could speak to in the Brazilian context. But when citizens can problem solve themselves, you get this vicious cycle where you see less political demand for change than we might expect under traditional theories of electoral accountability, because it's within the citizens' locus of control. The second thing, which both of my colleagues have highlighted already, is this question of attribution and responsibility. So decentralization was supposed to bring the problem closer to the people that were directly affected by it, to put power and to put control in the hands of the people who could most directly affect the problem. But with these gridded networked infrastructure services, that turns out to be really hard. So here's Mexico City. On the right, where you see those blue lines, those are the primary grid for the water grid. Those are controlled by the central city's water agency, SACMEX, the water authority. But then everything in the secondary grid, those little black lines, those are controlled by these 16 alcaldías, which you see on the left. This makes it almost impossible for one, the local mayors to solve the problem, even if they wanted to, and two, for the citizens to know who's to blame. So when I ask citizens how certain they are, whether it's the mayor, the local mayor, someone else responsible for each service, I get that, the average is like a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. People really don't know who to blame for their service quality. It's slightly better when you talk about trucks because the mayor delivers the trucks. And so there's some kind of face time there. But this question of attribution and responsibility, in addition to these coordination questions that Alison brought up, really mean that electoral accountability can't work as the lever it's supposed to work, because that line from citizen to politician to provider is not a straight one at all, like it looks like it might be in the World Bank diagram. And then the third thing that I wanted to highlight is that this is all endogenous. So these politicians are also taking deliberate action to keep these sort of losing valence issues off of the electoral agenda. So these are issues that are really hard to solve. The quality is poor. The politicians inherit this kind of low-level equilibrium, as Alison described. If I'm a politician, I don't want someone to bring this up. I don't think I can win on this issue. So in particular, I want to avoid large protests, right? So everyone has in their head Brazil 2013, Chile 2019, right? These big, massive protests that take politicians out of office, that require rewriting of the Constitution. They're really afraid that these citizen demands, if they do happen, will escalate to mass protests. So what I see is that the incumbents are actually on the back end pursuing strategies to help citizens cope with low quality and adjust with it, to monitor discontent, to know where it might rise up, and to kind of nip complaints in the bud before they become more serious. So in the case of water, what you see is that politicians invest a lot of money in giving out storage tanks, right? Because it's a whole lot easier to give out a storage tank than it is, and that will kind of like ensure people against this intermittency and then to actually fix the problem. But it suppresses demand, right? It becomes this kind of release valve for the political pressure that might build up if people were really experiencing their water intermittently. You also see these in Mexico, they're called Brigadas de Participación Ciudadana. You have politicians investing enormous efforts in getting to know their citizens, understanding where the problems are, anticipating complaints before they spill over into protest. And in my work, I find that, it's sort of counterintuitive. They spend a lot of effort on the opposition, not because they think they're going to win the votes, but because those are the people they're worried about, blockading a street and that turning into a Brazil 2013. And then the third thing is that they firefight, right? When problems come up, they come with these Band-Aid solutions. So in the case of water, that's a truck, right? You show up with a water truck, you quench people's thirst, you solve the immediate problem, and all of these actions are aimed at sort of providing release valves for citizen discontent. So they keep claims from escalating, they keep water off the electoral agenda despite low quality. And so you get this persistence of a status quo that nobody's particularly happy with, but the political mechanism kind of fails to activate in holding politicians accountable for the low quality of services. So the main point I want you to take away from all this is that electoral accountability overpromised, right? Democracy and decentralization, they weren't failures, they weren't failed promises, but they're not going to sort of kick in all circumstances. And they overpromised that this path would be pretty straightforward from citizen to politician to provider. And a lot can go wrong in that triangle. And in particular, in my context, what I see going wrong is that there's all these kind of intervening forces that prevent service quality from becoming this politically salient issue that sort of activates these democratic mechanisms. But I want to end a little more positively. I think there is hope, right? So I think of service quality as a sort of sleeping giant, right? If these things explode, they're potentially you know, office threatening. They can be tremendous amounts of change. And so one thing that I think that the literature has historically gotten wrong is treating accountability as a kind of linear process, like, oh, services get a little bit better by someone making a complaint and then the politician improves it a little bit. I expect that these changes in service quality are not going to be linear at all, right? We're going to see these triggering events where something gets bad and salient and kind of becomes a focal point for the population, and then someone has to do something, right? And you see some kind of change. I think this is increasingly likely as we get a more entitled middle class, right? As in Mexico City, at least, the water problems are getting so bad that they are affecting the middle class in a way that they have historically not. Because as much as Alice said, historically, these problems have been very concentrated among the poor, but as the city quite literally runs out of water, it's going to creep in and affect a population that knows how to make demands, that knows how to coordinate, that knows how to, you know, get on Twitter and get blockading. So I think it's not unlikely that we'll see momentum around these services. I just don't expect it to be kind of a steady march. I expect it to be much more kind of discontinuous. And then in the meantime, I think that this means that we may need to think about other channels besides electoral accountability through which service quality might be improved. So I didn't want to take up too much time, so I didn't talk about it, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. Trash and public transit in Mexico City look quite different, and the quality is much better. But the important point there is that those services are not good because of electoral accountability, right? They're good because of market dynamics, political economy. Alison mentioned large federal funding. We got a bunch of grants to improve public transit, and that's made a huge difference. And so I think that I'm skeptical of the effectiveness of electoral accountability as the main sort of insurer of public service quality, but I'm optimistic that I think public service quality does have scope for improving in these large services if we can get a handle on some of these questions of density that Alison alluded to. So I will stop there so we have some time for Q&A. Thank you all so much.
Wonderful. Thank you guys all so much. So I will keep a list. I want to kick us off with questions for our panel.
Thank you so much for these fascinating presentations. It's really neat to get to see all of my graduate student colleagues, the products of all of your hard work and thinking on this. My question here, Steve.
As planned.
Well, I'm curious about sort of Latin America in a very broad comparative perspective. I realize that Latin America is the focus of all your research, but I'm curious, with much of the discussion today was about the role of democracy and politics in improving public service and sort of the promise and disappointments of that as a path. I'm wondering in other parts of the world, whether in North America or Western Europe or other parts of the global South, has politics or democracy been the path through which we've seen high quality public service provision? Or is that the story that we're seeing elsewhere? Or is this sort of a story that we've had as kind of an ideal of how we might think democracy in Latin America should work, but maybe in practice is something we see elsewhere in the world either, even where we have high quality public service?
I might take like 3 questions and then we'll turn it over to you guys for a little round of responses. So June, do you want next?
I was fascinated by, I think, Alice's explanation of segregated and non-segregated cities. But I was wondering, and we've talked very little about transportation in this panel. What difference does it make in that picture if you have good transportation between the poor areas of the city and the richer areas of the city? That's not true.
Great. Steve, do you want to ask your question and then we'll turn it back to you guys?
2 quickies. First of all, really outstanding presentations. I learned so much from them. So it turns out the Gov department can churn out some pretty good, pretty quality scholars. 2 quick questions, one for Alison, one for Alyssa. For, I'm getting confused. One for Alice and one for Alyssa. Alice, tell us a little bit more about that middle class median voter in the big cities in Brazil. A middle class individual can be of various different types, and that can be income, that could be resident, education. What kind of middle class median voter are we talking about? And Alyssa, just taking off on the hope in the last bit of your presentation, if public service delivery is a sleeping giant, and if certain contingent circumstances can trigger sort of massive public support or public pressure for delivery, why doesn't some political entrepreneur who's third in the polls take it up? I understand why maybe the incumbent or the front runner might not want to take that risk, but why don't we ever see political entrepreneurs take up the issue?
Can we go in reverse order, guys, and we can do Alyssa, Alison for a round of responses to whatever fraction of those questions you feel like answering.
That has to be mine, though.
I had the least amount of time to think about the very last question, though.
Hey, I've asked you that question for years.
I was gonna say, Steve, that's the $1 million question. I think I've thought a lot about this in the Mexico City context, and I really think that crime is the spoiler here. I mean, and this is a specific answer for the question, and it's not a generic answer, but the Mexican voter will not care about water until someone does something compelling about crime. And crime is sort of, if you are a political entrepreneur and you are trying to attack the incumbent, it is so much easier to make a case that crime and delinquency are the problem than to sort of get the voter to stop thinking about water as a problem I can solve in my tinaco, and to think that water is the most important thing for my politician to do. That's not a neat, generalizable, common noun answer, but I think that's really what I've run up against, is that as long as water is within the locus of control of the citizen and crime is not, you're going to see this dynamic where the entrepreneurs are just getting more bite when they attack the incumbent on a crime. Aaron, your question is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about now, and I think the big thing that I'm curious about is what's going to happen in the States as this infrastructure that was extended pretty comprehensively erodes, right? So, California is running out of water, Arizona is running out of water. We have no capacity to tolerate intermittency. None of our systems are built for intermittency. No one stores their water. Public transit is eroding. The dynamics that Alison talked about in terms of fares and the low level equilibrium are hugely present in the discourse right now about public transit in the US. And so I don't have a good answer for you on how these services were extended initially, but I think that a lot of the failures of electoral accountability that we've been seeing in Latin America will apply to the US and Western Europe context as those infrastructure investments start to erode.
Great. Alice, do you want to take a stab at your questions?
Yes, just to, I guess, first build on what Alyssa was saying in response to Aaron's question. I guess overall for democracy in Europe, I don't have as much to say about this, but I do think that overall, if we just think about the political science literature more theoretically, there are reasons to presume that democratic institutions such as political competition would allow for more political accountability. There's research from David Savage, and there's this paper by Hecock on Mexico across states and cities about how more competitive elections allows for more democratic accountability and responsiveness to voters. And for, I think, Europe in particular, we do see more of the median voter framework at work. And in that sense, there is reason to presume that from those cases, it does seem that with more competitive elections, there's more convergence in policy to the preference of the median voter, which usually means, better social welfare policies, better services, whatever it may be that the median voter prefers. But it's just like puzzling that even, in the global South, the effects are not as obvious at times. So yeah, I guess there are different reasons for this. I have found just like personally looking at data that subnationally political competition at the city level in municipalities operates very differently than regime change and democratization federally in Brazil. So very locally, you can even see how like such democratic institutions can truncate time horizons of local mayors, encourage more short-sightedness and therefore less investments in more longer-term infrastructural investments in public services. So maybe that's like part of the story. Maybe there's like a difference between the federal and the subnational. Maybe it's like a regional thing in terms of differences between Europe and Latin America. It's not exactly clear to me yet. For Steve's question, to backtrack, for the other question about the difference between segregation and non-segregation and whether transportation is a part of this. I actually don't theorize at all about public transportation in my argument about segregation, in the sense that I'm only focused on what I call public externality goods, public services that result from spatial externalities of inequality that spill over from favelas to the middle class. And I actually argue that for public transit, it doesn't actually fit this bill because for public externality goods, it stems from a concentration of poverty, and therefore this concentration of poverty in slum settlements gives rise to all these, social bads, such as organized crime and cross-class crime and sewage contamination, sewage runoff that spills over. But for public transit, it more so for me stems from just like population density and less from the concentration of poverty and less from inequities across groups, but just having more people in the city in an area creates congestion, and therefore it creates more individual level externalities between individuals about blocking space, as opposed to my focus on segregation, which is very much about cross-group externalities between the middle and upper class and the poor. So, maybe this is not true, but for public transit, I actually haven't thought as much about it because it hasn't, for me, fit the bill as much for this externalities focus. And then for Steve's question about, is the middle class really the median voter? How is this measured? So I'll just say that this was first more so a crude measure in decadal censuses. So I looked at the 2010 census, 2000 census, the 1990 census to look at how many people there are in the city and where they fall in terms of income. And just looking at income itself, you do see that in the largest cities, the majority of the population is predominantly middle class. And by this, I mean above 2 or 3 minimum wages. So above 2 or 3 minimum wages to 6 to 8 minimum wages. And of course, these are just residents in the census. It's not clear if they're actually voters. If we were to actually look at the electorate, the voters in Brazil, there isn't voters by income. We can only measure the electorate by their education, which I guess relates to your other question. And for this, I just looked at middle educated voters. And for that pool, if we just focus on middle educated voters, we do see that with increasing population density, more of this electorate within cities will be in this middle educated pool. And then in the largest cities, they usually fall within this middle educated pool. So
Sorry,
that's how
what
I
exactly is middle educated?
I guess like besides like primary education, secondary, but high school, but not like university. Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. Allison.
Great. So first of all, I want to say I was wowed by the comments of my fellow panelists here, and I learned a lot from them. So I hope I'm getting the names right in terms of responses. So was it Fran who asked the public transit question?
That's Judy.
Oh, okay, Judy, thank you. So I think it's important that you brought this up because transit's an example where we actually have informal sector participation as an important part of provision. And we've been focusing primarily on the state in our conversation thus far. And so part of the reason that we observe a lot of informal sector provision is that this low-level equilibrium that we've been talking about in the context of water, as Alyssa just mentioned, takes on a very strong form in transit as well. So you have this, very understandable pressure to keep fares, the price of service low, particularly when there isn't good data and an administrative apparatus that allows for kind of a progressive pricing. And what this does, it means that whether you have the public sector or private concessionaires operating the service, they're simply not collecting enough in fees to actually deliver good quality services in terms of buses that are in good condition, enough buses going down routes to make the services frequent enough, et cetera. And so you have this, through a politicized regulatory process, you end up with essentially deteriorating service quality on the part of whoever is providing the quote public or formal sector service. And that could either be a regulated private entity or a public sector organization. So what you typically see is this kind of policy cycling in terms of, public sector manages it for a while, things gradually get really bad, they decide to privatize and have a concessionaire run it, things start off well because they've reset the tariffs, and then things get worse over time as they fail to kind of increase tariffs to keep pace with inflation. And so what you have is the informal sector kind of filling the gaps in that context, right? So as services get poorer and offer less frequently, there's a great business to be made by someone operating informal vans or other types of kind of makeshift services that service the places that are kind of not serviced well within the urban network. So it's messy. And I think that unfortunately, the dynamic is, one of policy cycling rather than of gradual improvement, at least based on what I've read in the sector. And this is a dynamic I talk a little bit about with co-authors in our piece on hybrid modes of public goods provision and perspectives on politics. To get to it's Aaron, right? Who offered, yeah, Aaron's question, which is also a great one. So it seems like thinking more broadly outside the Latin American context, as well as kind of across the Latin American experience, in the way that I think both Alyssa and particularly Alice highlighted, democracy is particularly good at improving access to services and helping divide up the pie. Right. So we don't have water coverage in a given neighborhood, or the police aren't going to a particular neighborhood. You start providing, rights for social goods of various sorts in the constitutions, and you allow for public protest, you allow poor communities to vote for representatives. And this really does, result in a political process that allows people to lobby for the expansion of important services to areas that have historically been underserved. And this is something, for example, that there's been a lot of work in India to kind of highlight these dynamics, just to give another regional example. So Ward Baranshot's work in Gujarat, Adam Auerbach, in Jaipur and other locations, right? It's something I've been looking at with colleagues in the context of water intermittency, which is a dynamic that Alyssa highlighted very effectively in her presentation. On the other hand, democracy is less good at improving management and investment dynamics in these services. So the kind of emerging consensus among policymakers in the water sector is that you need to have essentially the public sector managing it, right? Because that allows for less politicized subsidization of services. It allows for, provides a clear rationale for subsidized pricing, et cetera. However, these provision needs to be at a metropolitan or state scale rather than a municipal scale because of economies of scale and the way watersheds are constructed. And it needs to be insulated from everyday politics. So you actually can charge, particularly the middle and the upper class, enough to cover at least most of the costs of services. You don't want short-term political considerations coming into long-term capital planning for investments that may last 30 years. What does potentially also matter is getting societal interest groups that have long-term interests in the quality of whatever service it is we're talking about, whether it be water or policing, et cetera, to provide some political backing for those providers. So we can think about, just to bring some other authors into the conversation here. So Veronica Herrera's work on the water sector in Mexico, or Eduardo Mancada's work on policing in Colombia, they both look at how long-term business interests and political, in particular locations, kind of support reform efforts for urban services and kind of give some continuity in terms of the political backing as you kind of have turnover in whoever is kind of in big political roles locally. So that's kind of my response to Erin's question is we need to differentiate between kind of access versus system management.
Awesome. All right, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to use my role as chair to ask one lightning question with one sentence responses, which is, does the left in power at the city level matter for the extension or quality of urban services? Let's start with Alice, if you gave the clearest hint of an answer, and then I'll go Alison and Alyssa.
My answer, as I think you all know, is definitively yes, because the left, during the first decade of democratization in Brazil, extended rights to favelas to exist centrally in the city. And by default, this meant extension of services to these communities eventually.
Okay, let's go to Alison. Same response and same mechanism.
So the left is important in terms of expansion of access, absolutely. And I would love to see the empirical record, but my intuition is that parties on the right are going to be more likely to support these kind of efforts for long-term investment and reforms that consolidate that.
Okay, and Alyssa.
I don't know what the left means in Mexico anymore. But I will say that civil society is essential. I don't know if it's the left specifically these days in Mexico, but civil society matters.
Great. Well, thank you. And let's please join me in thanking our panelists for our interview.